Okay, so a little more explanation on radicals and absolute values. And this is in chapter 8. And it seems to come up mostly in the first 3 sections, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But let's say we have the square root of 49, a to the 8th power, and b to the let's see, b to the 14th power. Okay, something like that. And so you're taking the square root. The index is 2 because that's what the symbol says. There's no index written, and that means it's a square root. So we can take the square root of 49. That's not a problem. That's 7. And then when we look at a to the 8th, we're thinking about 8 divided by 2, right? So you could write it as 8 to the a divided by 2, and then we'll fix that in a minute. And then b to the 14 divided by 2. Okay, so you get 7a to the 4th and b to the 7th. Now, the absolute value part. In this case, we would put absolute values around the b to the 7th, and here's why. The a to the 4th, that's going to be positive, whether a is positive or negative. If a is a positive value, you raise it to the 4th power, it's going to be positive. But if a is a negative value and you raise it to the 4th power, it's still going to be positive. The problem is here when you have an odd exponent. So back on the a, that was an even exponent, so you don't need the absolute value. But here we have an odd exponent. We don't know if b is positive or if it's negative. And we need it to be positive because we're taking a square root, and so if b had wound up being, a negative value, that wouldn't have worked, okay? Let's see, I'm not explaining that very well. So you say, well, b to the 14th, that would be positive, and you're right. But the problem is here in the answer. The answer is saying b to the 7th. So let's say b was negative 2, and you raised it to the 14th power, and you had 49a to some power, whatever a was, and you're taking the square root. This would be positive, this would be positive, everything would be great, you could take the square root. But the problem is when you go to write it over here as an answer and you have 7a to the 4th, it didn't matter what a was, that's still going to be positive. But then you would have had negative 2, because that was b, right, to the 7th, and that's going to be negative. And you can't have that because it's going to be positive, okay? So it has to do with the way we write the answer. So the easiest way I think to remember is if it's an odd exponent, after you've taken the square root, then you're going to need the absolute values. If it's an even exponent, you don't need the absolute values. So the answer here would be 7a to the 4th, absolute value b to the 7th. Now on those answers, they usually just want the part that needs to be an absolute value in the absolute value symbols, okay? The other thing on that, I'm trying to think if I'm leaving anything out here on that part. The other thing is if it's an odd index, like you say you're taking the cubed root of something, a to the 9th and b to the 12th. Well, then that would be a to the 3rd, b to the 4th. You don't need any absolute values because it's an odd root. So it could be a negative answer, okay? It's going to be whatever it's going to be. So you don't need any absolute values because of this 3 here, because it's an odd root. The index is an odd number, okay? The other thing I'm just going to mention real quick is that at some point they usually say something like, okay, just assume the variables are positive because this notation gets a little bulky and awkward to work with. They're going to do that later on in the chapter. But for now, we're working with those absolute values, and I know there's some confusion on how that works. Hopefully that'll clear it up, and if not, keep sending me your questions by either email or in WebAssign, and I'll try to answer them.